the ghost that followed me home. I have a fascination with genealogy, which is what started all the trouble. My next-door neighbor and I were fellow hobbyists, and we often supported each other's search for long-lost ancestors. We would spend hours poring over stacks of dusty country records, wandering through poison ivy-strewn graveyards, and getting lost on back lanes trying to find the homes of retirees who remembered what our forebears were like way back when. On this particular day, we were traveling to a distant graveyard which conveniently happened to contain the graves of ancestors from both of our completely unrelated families. Cheryl's great-great-aunt and her other kin were quite easy to find, but we had to search high and low before we found the tomb of my third cousin once removed, one Samuel Beauregard Smith. I took a rubbing, recorded his information into one of my copious notebooks, and then stood examining the fancy stone for a few moments. "No expense spared here," I said to Cheryl. "Either someone really loved him, or someone was glad to see him go," Cheryl agreed with a grin. "Do you have any idea which it was?" "Nope. I just found out about his existence last Friday," I replied. We packed up our stuff after that, lunched at a quaint little tea house in the vicinity, and then went home. The early evening proceeded normally. At least, it did until I heard the squeak the front door made when it opened. I knew I had shut the door firmly when I came in, and I was pretty sure I'd locked it, but when I went into the hallway, the door was wide open, as if someone had just walked in. Behind me Soot, my black cat, started to purr. She walked delicately toward the front door and started twining herself around and around, as if she were rubbing against someone's legs in greeting. But there was no one there. My arms broke out in goosebumps, and I hastily shooed Soot away and closed the door. The cat continued to purr and leisurely walked into the living room, as if she were dogging the footsteps of some invisible presence. In the living room, Terry, my ancient fox terrier, hopped a greeting to a very empty-looking spot in the middle of the room, thumping his tail a few times before settling back down in his basket to snooze. I hurried away to the kitchen to do something normal, like the supper dishes, and then went right to bed, telling myself I was being over-imaginative and silly. The next morning, some of the cabinets were open, as if someone had been searching through them, looking for breakfast food. Pretending that I must have left them open last night, I hadn't. I closed them and ignored Soot's pert greeting to someone who just happened to be occupying the empty chair across from mine as I ate some cold cereal and got ready for work. I also pretended not to see the unfolded newspaper on the kitchen table as I grabbed my keys, and I absolutely did not see one of the pages start to turn as I walked out the back door. For almost 2 weeks, I ignored the invisible person living in the house with me, although it felt like a he, drove me crazy, leaving cabinets open, scuffling up the rugs, rearranging the furniture to suit his fancies, and forgetting to turn off lights. But when he started whistling off-key, I'd had enough. I'd told Cheryl about my unwanted guest. She'd been reluctant to believe me until she came over one morning and found someone invisibly reading the newspaper. After that, she gave me the name of a psychic, and I gave the woman a call. Cheryl wanted to be here when the psychic arrived, but she was called over to her daughter's house to babysit, and so she missed out on the grand entrance. The psychic was a nice, normal-looking brunette who stiffened as soon as she entered the house and said, "Yes, you do have a ghost," before I even had a chance to take her coat. We sat down in the living room, and the psychic quickly made contact with the spirit. And what do you know? It was Samuel Beauregard Smith. Apparently, he'd seen me visiting the graveyard and decided I reminded him of his first wife, so he followed me home. "I'm flattered," I said carefully, "but it isn't seemly for a widow to be sharing her home with a bachelor such as yourself." As the psychic relayed my message to the ghost, I heard Cheryl's car pulling into her driveway and knew she would be over any minute. "Samuel has agreed to leave the house," the psychic said. I wondered where his spirit usually resided, but decided it would not be appropriate to ask such a personal question. A moment later, a feeling of emptiness filled the room. "Samuel is gone," the psychic told me. After thanking the psychic and paying her for her services, I escorted her to the front door just in time to see Cheryl hurrying up the front walk. The two women nodded to each other as they passed, and then Cheryl burst into the hallway. Was that the psychic? What did she say? And who was the old-fashioned man with the white mustache who came out your front door just as I was pulling into my driveway? My mouth dropped open in shock. Closing it, I swallowed and sat down rather abruptly. What is it? What did I say? Asked Cheryl, alarmed by my pallor. Nothing, I said, slowly beginning to grin. You just saw Samuel Beauregard Smith leaving the house at my request. Now it was Cheryl's turn to sit abruptly. Samuel Beauregard Smith? She asked incredulously. That third cousin of yours with the fancy tombstone? I nodded. I just saw his ghost, she said. You just saw his ghost, I confirmed. For the first time since we'd met, Cheryl was speechless. I laughed suddenly and got up. It will be nice to have my house to myself again, I told her, and went to the kitchen to make us some tea. The grave. A young woman lay suffering on her deathbed, her stillborn baby lying against her chest. Her young husband crouched close, stricken with grief. His beautiful wife crooned a lullaby to her dead baby, her voice growing fainter as death drew near. Finally, she looked at her husband and asked him to bury her back east, beside her dead mother. Choked with grief, the young husband agreed. But after his wife lay still in death, her husband could not bear to be parted from her and their dead child. He had them buried together beneath a lonely pine tree on a gently sloping knoll near their home, where he could visit the grave. As spring drew near, fragrant wildflowers bloomed across the knoll and the small grave. One night, the husband threw himself across the flower-strewn grave, head buried in his arms as he tried to control his grief. As he lay there, the stillness of the night seemed to deepen. A light breeze tousled his hair and swayed the branches of the pine tree. At that moment, he heard a soft voice crooning a lullaby. He started upright, searching about for his wife. He heard a gurgle from an infant, a happy sound of contentment. Then the breeze died away, and the branches of the pine tree stilled. Then a shining light seemed to descend from the dark sky and hover over the young husband and the small grave under the tree. The husband heard the singing again and the happy laugh of a small child. And then there was darkness. The husband went home that night with peace in his heart for the first time since the death of his wife. People say that on dark, summery nights you can still hear the young mother singing a lullaby and hear the happy chuckles of her tiny child. The grocer. It was a very hard time for the newlywed couple. The depression had hit hard, and the young husband was desperately seeking a job to support his new wife, without success. She had no training herself, and all the entry-level jobs for which she might qualify were snatched up as soon as they opened. Finally, the young husband decided to use his last few dollars to travel to Seattle and look for work. His wife did not like this idea at all, but said nothing in protest even though she had just learned that she carried their first child. There were no jobs in Eastern Washington, so what else could her husband do? She didn't tell him about the baby. That would be more pressure than he could bear. She just hugged him goodbye and nodded tearfully when he told her he arranged a line of credit with the local grocer so she would be adequately fed and sheltered while he was gone. The young wife hated buying on credit, but the old man who owned the grocery was very kind and did not mention the growing debt to her. Instead, they chatted about local events and the weather. She learned from her neighbors that he was supporting several needy families in this way, which made her feel a little better about the situation. The days were long and empty for the young wife. She kept the tiny house spotless, but she was increasingly ill from her pregnancy, so she mostly stayed home. After 2 months, she reached the limit of the credit her husband had procured for her. Feeling wretchedly ill and too proud to beg the grocer to exceed her line of credit, she eked out her meager supplies until she had nothing left, not even fuel for the stove. By then, she was so depressed and weak from hunger that she huddled under the bed covers for warmth and stayed there as much as possible to keep from freezing to death. Several miserable days had passed in this manner when she heard a knock at her front door. She was weak from hunger and shivering with cold, but she got out of bed anyway and shuffled to the front door. When she opened it, no one there. But on the stoop were 2 boxes full of groceries and enough fuel to last for the next month. She fell to her knees, overwhelmed by such a gesture. Her husband must have gotten word to the grocer that he had enough money to extend their credit. And bless the man, the grocer had delivered supplies right to her door. With shaking hands, the young wife pulled the heavy boxes into the cold house and had her first meal in days sitting on the floor by the front door. She was very careful with the fuel and food, for winter was upon them and she had to make it last until her husband returned. But no matter how little she ate, the supplies dwindled too quickly until she had eaten every last morsel and the fuel was gone. She would have to go to the grocer in the morning and see if there was any more credit, she decided after her last meal. That night, she was seized by a great pain. Within a few minutes, she had lost the baby and lay ill in bed for several days afterward, unable to move further than their tiny bathroom which stood right beside the bedroom. She was weak with pain and hunger and miserable in spirit when she heard a rat-a-tat-tat on the front door. She propped herself up against the pillows weakly, her heart springing up with hope. Was it her husband? No, he wouldn't knock. But the grocer would. Wearily, she dragged herself to the door on hands and knees. She feebly pulled herself upright on the doorknob, ashamed to appear before her visitor in such a bedraggled state but unable to do anything about it. She opened the door. Again, no one was there. But the expected supplies were on the stoop. She cried with relief as she pulled them inside the door and shut it against the cold. Bless the grocer. Bless him and her husband who was providing for her from afar. Soon, the house was warm and she was feeling better. The food helped her body heal from the lost pregnancy, and within a couple of weeks, she was ready to venture out of doors. She was determined to go to the grocery store and thank the proprietor who had delivered to her door when she needed food so desperately. Donning her hat and best dress, she walked out into the fresh air of early spring and made her way slowly toward the local grocery store. To her complete astonishment, she found the shop locked and the windows papered over. The store was closed and had obviously been closed for some time. A woman passing by asked the young wife if she needed help. The young wife turned to her in some distress and asked her about the grocer. "Didn't you know?" the woman replied. "The proprietor of our local grocery died just before the new year. We've got to go all the way into downtown Spokane now to get supplies." The young wife blanched and swayed when she heard this news. The woman, alarmed, asked if anything was wrong. The young wife shook her head, thanked the woman for the information, and slowly began the walk home. The delivered groceries had come from this store. She had recognized the boxes they were delivered in. And no one else in the area knew she was in distressed circumstances. Indeed, she had no friends or family to turn to in the area. So who had delivered the groceries to her? But she knew already by the prickling sensation along her arms and the back of her neck. There was only one person who could have known that she was quietly starving to death in her little house. The dead grocer. And by some miracle, he had kept faith with her and her husband, delivering groceries to his starving wife long after he himself had passed away. A few days later, the husband returned without money, but with seeds enough to start a garden. By the time the grocer's final gift had been used up, they had food coming in from their garden, and the husband had found part-time work enough to help them through the rest of the depression. But the young wife knew she would never have survived if it hadn't been for the generosity of the phantom grocer of Spokane. The headless bride. Once there was a lovely young woman growing up in a wealthy shipping family in New York. In those days, wealthy young women were expected to make their debut in society and to marry a wealthy young man from a good family. But our young lady was a bit of a rebel. When she grew old enough to marry, she scorned the wealthy young society men in favor of an older man who was working as a servant in her house. Once there was a lovely young woman growing up in a wealthy shipping family in New York. In those days, wealthy young women were expected to make their debut in society and to marry a wealthy young man from a good family, but our young lady was a bit of a rebel. When she grew old enough to marry, she scorned the wealthy young society men in favor of an older man who was working as a servant in her house. Of course, there was a big argument within the family when the young woman announced her choice of husband. Her parents were furious, particularly her father, who accused the servant of courting his daughter in order to gain a prominent position in the shipping company. When the young lady insisted upon the marriage, her father gave the couple a lump sum of cash with the stipulation that they leave New York after the wedding and never come back. By the time the young couple reached the Old Faithful Inn in Yellowstone, the new husband had gambled away all of the money that his wife's family had bestowed upon the newlyweds. There was barely enough money for the couple to finish their honeymoon trip, and nothing whatsoever with which to buy a house or start a family. The young woman was upset with her husband. They had quarreled often about money during their honeymoon journey, and by this time, she knew that her father had been right about the greed of her new husband. He was obviously more interested in her money than in her. Still, the couple was flat broke and needed something to pay the concessionaires here at Yellowstone, so she telephoned her father to ask him for some money. Her father refused to give her a penny. That night, the couple had a terrific fight in the relative privacy of their bedroom at the inn. The husband stalked out of the inn in a fury, leaving his bride locked in her room. The bride did not emerge for days, and finally the staff of the inn sent someone to check on her. No one answered when the housekeeper knocked on the door. Using the housekeeping key, the staffer stepped into the room and gasped in shock. The room looked as if a hurricane had swept through the interior. Clothes were strewn everywhere, and the bedclothes were partially on the floor. Worse, the housekeeper was overwhelmed by the metallic odor smell that permeated everything. There was no sign of the bride, but the stink that wafted from the attached bathroom hinted at what the housekeeper might see. Lying in the bathtub in a pool of congealed blood was the body of the unhappy bride, which ended grotesquely in the ragged stump of a neck. Her head was nowhere to be seen. The housekeeper's screams summoned the rest of the staff. The authorities were summoned, the family was notified, and the room cleaned. Everything was done to locate the murderer, but the husband was never apprehended. Finally, the whole story was hushed up to avoid scandal to the prominent family. A few days after the discovery of the murder, a foul smell up in the crow's nest where the musicians often played for the evening dances was traced to its source, the bride's severed head. Tousled blonde curls framed the wide-eyed, horror-twisted face, already beginning to rot. The burial of the poor, murdered bride should have been the end of the terrible incident. And so it proved, until one midnight when a staff member who was up late reading a book heard a strange noise coming from the lobby. It was the stroke of midnight when he hurried onto the balcony and looked upward, seeking the source of the noise. He looked up towards the crow's nest, far above, and saw a glowing figure in white slowly descending the stairs from the crow's nest. Tucked under its arm was a tousle-curled, wide-eyed head. Frozen with horror, the man watched the bride descend the steps and float along the corridor until she reached the door of her room. Then she vanished. From that day onward, there are people who say they can see the headless bride walking down the stairs from the crow's nest at the stroke of midnight, sadly seeking for her lost husband and her lost dreams. Myself, I've never stayed up to see the headless horseman. One cold winter night, early in the new year, a certain Dutchman left the tavern in Tarrytown and started walking to his home in the hollow nearby. His path led next to the old Sleepy Hollow cemetery where a headless Hessian soldier was buried. At midnight, the Dutchman came within sight of the graveyard. The weather had warmed up during the week and the smell was almost gone from the road. It was a dark night with no moon, and the only light came from his lantern. The Dutchman was nervous about passing the graveyard, remembering the rumors of a galloping ghost that he had heard at the tavern. He stumbled along, humming to himself to keep up his courage. Suddenly, his eye was caught by a light rising from the ground in the cemetery. He stopped, his heart pounding in fear. Before his startled eyes, a white mist burst forth from an unmarked grave and formed into a large horse carrying a headless rider. The Dutchman let out a terrible scream as the horse leapt toward him at a full gallop. He took to his heels, running as fast as he could, making for the bridge since he knew that ghosts and evil spirits did not care to cross running water. He stumbled suddenly and fell, rolling off the road into a melting patch of snow. The headless rider thundered past him, and the man got a second look at the headless ghost. It was wearing a Hessian commander's uniform. The Dutchman waited a good hour after the ghost disappeared before crawling out of the bushes and making his way home. After fortifying himself with schnapps, the Dutchman told his wife about the ghost. By noon of the next day, the story was all over Tarrytown. The good Dutch folk were divided in their opinions. Some thought that the ghost must be roaming the roads at night in search of its head. Others claimed that the Hessian soldier rose from the grave to lead the Hessian soldiers in a charge up nearby Chatterton Hill, not knowing that the hill had already been taken by the British. Whatever the reason, the headless horseman continues to roam the roads near Tarrytown on dark nights from that day to this.